Karen threw hot coffee at my sister. Didn't know we were sitting with two detectives. My little sister and I had chosen our favorite local cafe, a quiet place tucked between a florist and a bookstore, where we often came to unwind after a long week. The cafe was cozy and filled with the soothing hum of espresso machines, soft indie music, and murmured conversations. My sister, always the quieter one between us, was sipping her vanilla chai latte and reading a book she brought along, a fantasy novel with a dragon on the cover. She always preferred to escape into fictional worlds rather than deal with the real one, and I didn't blame her. The world wasn't always kind to people like her, sensitive, soft-spoken, and often misunderstood. I was halfway through my own coffee, scrolling through my phone, when the entrance bell chimed, sharp and shrill, as if it sensed trouble coming in. That's when she walked in. The woman was hard to miss, short blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, fake designer bag slung over her shoulder, and a look on her face like she had just smelled something sour. She immediately made a beeline for the counter, barking at the barista before she even reached the front. "Why is the music so depressing in here? Can't you put on something normal?" she snapped, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. The barista, a young guy who looked like he was working through college, gave a polite but tired smile and told her the playlist was curated by the owner. She scoffed at that, muttering under her breath, and ordered a large oat milk latte with a tone that made it sound like a punishment rather than a drink request. I didn't pay her much mind at first. You get all kinds in cafes: students, hipsters, tired parents, and yes, the occasional entitled customer who thinks their $5 order comes with the right to run the place. My sister didn't even look up from her book. But then Karen, as she would soon be known to us, started to prowl the cafe like a lioness hunting prey, her eyes darting from table to table with clear disapproval etched onto her face. She was looking for someone to judge, someone to pick on, someone to blame for whatever irritation was crawling under her skin that day. It didn't take long before her gaze landed on us. I could feel her stare before I even looked up. It was sharp and invasive, the kind of stare that makes you feel like you've done something wrong without knowing what. I turned my head and met her eyes, and in that brief moment something shifted. She narrowed her gaze, tilted her head as if studying an odd insect, and then her attention zeroed in on my sister. My sister hadn't noticed. She was still lost in her book, oblivious to the storm brewing a few feet away. Karen took a slow sip of her coffee, then made her way over to our table, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like an ominous countdown. She stopped right beside us, arms crossed, coffee cup in hand, and stared down at my sister like she was something offensive. "What's wrong with her?" she asked loudly, not even addressing us properly, just directing her words into the air like we weren't human beings but background noise. My sister looked up, startled, eyes wide behind her glasses. "Excuse me?" I asked, my tone sharp and defensive. Karen didn't back down. She leaned closer and gestured vaguely at my sister. "Her vibe is off. She's giving me weird energy. Is she okay, like, mentally?" I felt the heat rise in my face as my hands curled into fists. "She's reading a book," I said, forcing my voice to stay level. "She's not bothering anyone." My sister sank a little in her seat, visibly upset, her fingers trembling as she turned the page despite no longer reading. Karen huffed, like our existence alone was a personal affront. "Well, maybe she shouldn't stare so much. It's creepy. Some of us are sensitive to that kind of energy." She said the word energy like she had just discovered it from a self-help blog, like it made her some kind of spiritual authority. Before I could respond, I heard chairs scrape against the floor. At a table nearby, two men who had been sitting quietly this whole time stood up. They looked average, mid-40s, jeans and plain shirts, the kind of guys you wouldn't notice in a crowd. But there was something in the way they moved, with calm authority and quiet precision, that instantly told me they weren't just regular customers. One of them stepped forward, speaking with a voice that cut through the tension like a blade. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stop harassing these patrons." Karen blinked in surprise, taking a step back. "And who are you?" "The cafe police," she said with a mocking laugh, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. The man pulled out a badge with a smooth motion and the cafe fell dead silent. "Detective Roman off duty but still within jurisdiction," he said calmly. "This young woman has been sitting here quietly. You've approached her, insulted her, and now you're disturbing the peace of everyone here. That's enough." Karen sputtered, her mouth opening and closing like a goldfish. She was staring at me. She made me uncomfortable. She tried again, now sounding defensive, not authoritative. The other detective, a taller man with a no-nonsense expression, crossed his arms and added, "So your response was to approach her and berate her in public. That's not how discomfort is handled, ma'am." The barista behind the counter quietly nodded, and a few other customers murmured in agreement. But Karen wasn't finished. She turned back to us, glaring, and before anyone could react, she raised her cup and launched the contents directly at my sister. The moment felt slow, like time itself had paused to watch her stupidity unfold. The hot latte arced through the air in a horrifying splash. My sister screamed, stumbling back, the liquid hitting her shoulder and part of her neck. I shot up from my chair, instinctively reaching for her, and saw red. But I didn't get the chance to confront Karen, because the detectives were already moving. The second the hot latte made contact with my sister's shoulder, the entire atmosphere of the cafe shifted. The quiet hum of relaxed conversation and gentle background music snapped into silence, replaced by gasps, the clattering of dropped cutlery, and the unmistakable sound of a chair being knocked over as my sister jumped to her feet in pain and shock. The front of her hoodie was now soaked, the light gray fabric darkened by the spilled drink, steam curling up from it ominously. Her face twisted into a look of stunned hurt as she instinctively backed away, her arms trembling, trying to pull the fabric away from her neck where the worst of the scalding liquid had landed. I reached for her, panic kicking in, brushing her hair away from her shoulder to see if her skin had been burned. Her neck was already turning pink, and I could see tears pooling in the corners of her eyes, not just from the pain, but from the sheer humiliation of being attacked like that in front of a crowd of strangers. I was halfway through saying something to her, asking if she was okay, if it hurt, what she needed, when the voice of one of the detectives sliced through the chaos like a whip crack. "That's assault, you're done." Karen, who had taken a defiant stance after throwing her drink like she was expecting applause, blinked in confusion as the taller detective closed in. "What? It was just coffee," she barked, holding up her empty cup as if it was some kind of defense. "She was making me uncomfortable. I have a right to defend my peace." Her tone was laced with self-righteousness, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes now. Maybe it was the sight of my sister crying. Maybe it was the hushed murmurs growing louder around the cafe. Or maybe it was the detective pulling out a pair of handcuffs with the same practiced ease as someone tying their shoelaces. I stepped to the side as the detective moved in, not wanting to be in the way as he addressed Karen again, his voice steady but deadly serious. "You just threw hot liquid at a minor in a public place. That is attempted bodily harm. You are under arrest." Karen's eyes widened, the full weight of those words seemingly taking a moment to register. She stepped back, bumping into a chair, and then looked around the cafe like she expected someone to jump to her defense. No one moved. Even the barista was standing frozen behind the counter, eyes wide as he dialed his phone, likely calling in the incident to emergency services. One of the other customers, an older woman in a floral scarf, shook her head in disbelief and muttered, "She really did it. I can't believe it." Karen's bravado started to crack. "You can't arrest me," she said, but her voice wavered. "I didn't mean to, she just kept staring at me weird." She tried to take another sip of what little was left in her cup, maybe hopping to find some calm, some control. But before the rim even reached her lips, the detective smoothly moved in, pulled the cup from her hand, and in one fluid motion twisted her arms behind her back. The click of the handcuffs was loud, final, and for a moment Karen looked too stunned to even resist. She blinked as if waking from a bad dream, then twisted in the detective's grip. "You're making a mistake. She's the one who—" "No," the second detective interrupted, stepping in and gesturing toward my sister and me. "We saw the whole thing, and so did half the people in this cafe. You are going to sit down and wait for the patrol unit, or we'll have you charged with resisting on top of everything else." Karen huffed, looking like she was on the verge of either screaming or bursting into tears, but then the weight of the stares around her must have finally hit her. Everyone was watching. No one was on her side. She slumped slightly as she was guided to a chair near the wall, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back, her face flushed with either embarrassment or anger, or more likely, both. My sister was still shaking, and I knelt beside her, helping her out of her hoodie and using a handful of napkins someone handed me to gently pat her skin. The burns didn't look severe, but they were angry and red, and the tears in her eyes hadn't stopped. "You're okay," I whispered, trying to comfort her, even as my own heart was pounding in my chest. "You're safe now. She can't hurt you." Paramedics arrived a few minutes later, ushered in by the cafe staff, and one of them quickly took over, checking my sister's neck and shoulder with professional calm. They said it was a superficial burn, but that it should still be monitored. They gave her a cool compress and asked if she wanted to go to the hospital, but my sister shook her head, clearly overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. While the paramedics worked, the two detectives gave statements to the responding officers who showed up a few minutes after them. Karen was still in cuffs, still trying to talk her way out of it, but her voice had lost all its earlier venom. Now she just sounded pathetic, floundering through excuses about weird energy, about being provoked, and about feeling threatened, but none of it was landing. The officers weren't buying it, and the witnesses, every single person who had watched the situation unfold, had already begun lining up to confirm what had happened. The cafe manager came over to us with 2 fresh drinks on the house and an apology that wasn't his to make but was appreciated all the same. "I'm so sorry," he said, his hands wringing nervously. "We've never had anything like this happen here. We're going to give the security footage to the cops. Please let me know if there's anything else we can do." I thanked him, barely able to find the words. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving behind a mixture of exhaustion, rage, and disbelief. Karen was escorted out of the cafe by the 2 uniformed officers, still protesting, though with less and less confidence in her voice. The door closed behind her, and just like that she was gone. The cafe remained silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that follows a thunderclap, before slowly the normal sounds of life returned. Dishes clinked, conversations resumed in hushed tones, and someone started the playlist over from the beginning. The detectives came back to check on us, reassuring us that charges would be filed and that we could expect to be contacted to give formal statements. One of them, Detective Roman, handed me a card and told me to call if we needed anything at all. I looked at my sister, who was now holding the cold compress against her neck and staring blankly at her tea. She hadn't said much, and I knew it would take her time to process what had just happened. But I also knew she would be okay. She had been hurt, yes, but she wasn't broken. Not this time, not on my watch, and certainly not by someone like Karen. By the time we left the cafe, the sun had moved past its lazy morning glow and taken on the harsher tone of midday, casting long shadows across the sidewalk as we made our way slowly back to the car. My sister still held the cold compress to her neck, and though the initial pain had dulled, I could tell the sting of what had happened lingered more deeply in her spirit than in her skin. The paramedics had reassured us she'd be fine with proper aftercare, but no amount of aloe or burn cream could undo the humiliation she'd endured. She was quiet, not because she didn't want to speak, but because she didn't know how to, and I didn't push her. Sometimes silence is the only way to process trauma, letting it settle until you're ready to sift through the emotional debris. I just stayed close, driving carefully, glancing at her now and then to make sure she was still okay, physically and mentally. We spent the rest of that day at home, and although we both tried to return to some sense of normalcy, the memory of that latte, of the heat, the shock, the moment it happened, kept replaying like a scratched record. I watched my sister as she curled up on the couch, hoodie replaced by a soft blanket, book discarded on the coffee table. She was normally the kind of person who'd laugh at a badly written romance subplot or gasp loudly during a plot twist, but today she just stared at the muted TV screen, eyes distant, thoughts clearly elsewhere. I didn't press. I ordered her favorite takeout, made sure she stayed hydrated, and hovered like a helicopter without being obvious. She didn't speak until night fell. "I didn't even look at her," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the heater. "Not in a weird way, I was just reading." I looked up from the table where I was half-heartedly scrolling through my laptop, and my heart ached at the lost tone in her voice. "I know," I said gently, setting the computer aside. "You didn't do anything wrong." "But she trailed off, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "She said my vibe was off, like I made her uncomfortable just by existing." I hated how much that sentence hurt her, how deeply it had burrowed into her already delicate self-esteem. My sister had always struggled with anxiety and a sense of not fitting in. School had been hard, social gatherings harder, and now, even something as innocent as reading in a cafe had turned into a traumatic experience at the hands of an unstable stranger. I sat beside her and let her lean her head against my shoulder. "Some people do like what they don't understand," I said. "They don't get quiet people, or kind ones, or people who mind their own business, but that doesn't make them right, that makes them wrong." She didn't reply, but the way she rested against me a little more told me that she heard me, that she believed me, at least a little. It was a start. The following Monday, we received a call from the local precinct. Detective Roman's name popped up on my phone, and his voice was just as calm and professional as I remembered. He said they were moving ahead with formal charges against Cairn and needed both of us to come in to give full statements. The cafe staff had provided the security footage, and there were at least half a dozen witness reports corroborating the events. Cairn had been processed the day of the incident but had since posted bail. "She's out," he said, "but she's facing multiple charges: assault, disturbing the peace, and creating a public nuisance. We're also pushing for a count of attempted bodily harm due to the temperature of the drink. That part might stick." When I relayed this to my sister, she looked surprised, even skeptical. "They're really taking it seriously?" she asked, as though the idea of justice being applied to her life was somehow foreign. "They are," I confirmed. "You have a right to be safe in public spaces, and throwing hot coffee at someone isn't just rude, it's dangerous. That's not just a Cairn moment, that's a crime." We visited the station 2 days later. The building itself was old, the kind of structure that had seen decades of paperwork and politics, with walls that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. Detective Roman met us at the front desk and led us to a small, windowless room where we sat opposite a recording device. My sister was nervous at first, her hands fidgeting with the sleeves of her sweater, but once she started talking, the words flowed out like a dam breaking. She spoke clearly, recounting everything from the moment we sat down at the cafe to the moment the hot liquid hit her skin. She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, she just told the truth. When she was finished, there was a stillness in the room, and Roman nodded with visible respect. "You did good," he told her. "You were honest, and that's what matters. These things can be messy, but you did nothing wrong. Just being somewhere and existing shouldn't be a crime." After giving my own statement, which confirmed everything she said and added some detail about Cairn's behavior leading up to the assault, we were told the case would go before a local judge within the month. Cairn had hired a lawyer, apparently one of those overly confident types who appeared on local commercials promising justice for the wrongfully accused, but the evidence was strong. Between the footage, the witnesses, and the fact that she had thrown a scalding drink in a room full of people, her defense had a steep hill to climb. Despite the seriousness of the situation, there was something oddly therapeutic about that visit. My sister walked out of the station standing a little straighter, her shoulders less hunched. She had been seen, heard, believed, and more importantly, someone was actually going to do something about what had happened. In a world that often dismisses the pain of quiet people, this was no small thing. That night, as we sat on the balcony with mugs of tea in hand, carefully lukewarm, of course, my sister spoke again, her voice more confident than I'd heard in days. "I still can't believe she got arrested while drinking her second coffee," she said, a ghost of a smile playing at her lips. I laughed, a real laugh, not forced or nervous. "Right. She got cuffed mid-sip like a scene out of a TV show." We both chuckled, and though the scar on her neck was still red and healing, something deeper inside her had begun to mend. Justice, after all, wasn't just about punishment. Sometimes it was about validation, about knowing the world saw what you went through and agreed it was okay. And as the night wrapped around us, warm drinks in hand, I realized we had already taken our first steps back toward normal. Karen had tried to break something fragile, but all she really did was expose her own ugliness, and now the world would see it for what it was. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and cold air, a sterile, institutional scent that clung to the walls and floor like history itself. Rows of rigid benches stretched across the small space, flanked by pale beige walls and a large seal mounted above the judge's seat, its bronze gleam dulled by years of fluorescent lighting. It had been nearly a month since the incident, and while the physical burn on my sister's neck had mostly healed, leaving behind only a faint pink patch where skin had once blistered, the emotional toll still weighed on both of us. Coming here today felt both necessary and surreal, as though we were finally standing at the edge of a story we didn't choose to be part of. My sister sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, fingers curled tightly around a tissue in her lap, her eyes fixed on a speck of dust drifting through the shaft of sunlight that filtered through the window blinds. She didn't speak, but I could feel her nervousness vibrating off her like static, and I wanted nothing more than to shield her from it all. The room was slowly filling. A bailiff moved quietly along the back wall, checking papers. A young clerk flipped through a stack of files near the judge's bench. A couple of people sat in the pews toward the back, likely there for other cases or out of morbid curiosity. The low hum of shuffling papers and hushed voices created a bubble of tension as the minutes crawled by. Then, at exactly 9:00 a.m., the door opened with a loud metallic creak and she walked in. Karen. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly into a bun that looked like it hurt, and she wore a stiff black blazer that clearly hadn't been tailored for her body. She held herself like someone walking into a job interview, trying to seem respectable and composed, but the wild glint in her eyes betrayed her true nature. She didn't look at us as she passed by, her heels tapping sharply on the linoleum floor, but I saw her jaw clench and her lips tighten in that same annoyed expression from the cafe. Trailing behind her was a man in a rumpled suit who looked like he had either just rolled out of bed or hadn't slept the night before. Her lawyer. He barely glanced at us as he adjusted his tie and whispered something to Karen, who nodded quickly, eager for direction. They sat down across from us, and a silence fell over the room like a dropped curtain. Moments later, the judge entered, a stern-faced woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a low bun. She looked like she'd seen everything at least twice and didn't have time for nonsense. Everyone rose, then sat when instructed, and just like that, the proceedings began. The judge reviewed the docket, then called the case. "State of California versus Karen Mitchell," she announced in a crisp voice, flipping through the folder in front of her. "Charges: misdemeanor assault, attempted bodily harm, and public disturbance." Karen's lawyer stood and offered the expected not guilty plea on her behalf, but I noticed the hesitation in his tone. He knew what he was up against. There was footage, witnesses, detectives. This wasn't some petty misunderstanding that could be brushed off or buried in bureaucracy. This was real, and Karen, despite her usual air of superiority, seemed to finally realize it. Her shoulders had stiffened, and her eyes darted quickly around the room before settling on the judge's face like a lifeline. The prosecution was efficient. They opened with a simple, unembellished statement. The defendant had, without provocation, assaulted a young woman in a public cafe by throwing a scalding hot drink at her, an act witnessed by several bystanders and 2 off-duty detectives. The security footage, they explained, would show everything, and several statements from patrons were already on record. They weren't seeking jail time, they clarified, but rather a combination of fines, mandated therapy for anger management, and community service. The goal wasn't revenge, but accountability. Then it was our turn. Detective Roman was called first. He took the stand with a kind of quiet confidence that made the room seem smaller somehow, like everything he said carried undeniable weight. He recounted the incident exactly as it happened, confirming that he and his partner had witnessed the altercation from start to finish, that Karen had approached unprovoked, had verbally harassed my sister, and then thrown the drink with clear intent. He didn't dramatize anything. His delivery was calm, professional, and devastatingly factual. Karen's lawyer tried to question his credibility on the grounds that Roman was off-duty, but the judge quickly dismissed the line of questioning, stating that witnessing a crime doesn't require a badge to make it real. Next came the barista, who nervously took the stand but confirmed everything Roman said. Then a young woman who had been sitting near us that day. Then the cafe manager. Each voice added another brick to the case, layering reality over any doubt Karen's defense might have hoped to create. When my sister was called, she looked like she wanted to vanish. Her hands trembled as she took the oath and sat down, the microphone too close to her mouth at first. I watched her swallow hard before she spoke, her voice soft but steady. She explained how Karen had approached her, accused her of bad energy, and mocked her for her quietness before suddenly and violently throwing a hot drink in her face. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She just told the truth. And as she did, I saw the judge lean in ever so slightly, listening carefully, watching my sister not just as a victim but as a person. Karen's lawyer cross-examined her, asking loaded questions meant to paint my sister as somehow unstable or strange. "Did you stare at Ms. Mitchell in a way that could have been misinterpreted?" he asked. My sister blinked, clearly hurt by the implication, but answered clearly, "I was reading a book. I didn't look at her until she walked up to me and started yelling." The judge nodded and jotted something down. The moment passed and Karen's case unraveled further. When Karen finally took the stand, her performance was a disaster. She tried to act like the victim, claiming she had felt spiritually threatened by my sister's energy and that she had acted out of a deep emotional panic. Her lawyer had clearly coached her to lean into the language of mental distress, but it was obvious to everyone in the room that it was a thinly veiled attempt to justify unjustifiable behavior. The judge listened patiently but without sympathy. And when Karen said, "It wasn't hot enough to do damage," the prosecution leaned in with the medical report from the paramedics, describing the burn in clinical detail. That was the nail in the coffin. By the end of the session, the judge announced she would review the evidence further and render her verdict in 2 days. We were told we could go. As we left the courtroom, Karen refused to look at us, her face pale and rigid, her mask of control slipping with every step. My sister didn't say anything as we walked outside, but her shoulders weren't hunched anymore. She held her head higher, her eyes a little sharper, and for the first time since that terrible day in the cafe, I saw something flicker in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not pain, but resolve. We were nearly at the end now, and justice, long overdue, felt closer than ever. The courthouse felt different when we returned 2 days later, not in appearance, but in atmosphere, like the air itself had changed somehow. It was heavier with anticipation yet calmer, as though the building, after holding so much tension, was finally preparing to release it. My sister and I arrived early, settling into the same seats we had before, though this time she didn't fidget or shrink into herself. She sat straighter, her chin lifted just enough to suggest she no longer felt small or invisible. She wore a soft blue sweater, the faint scar on her neck just barely visible in the collar's shadow, and though her hands were still folded tightly in her lap, I could see a quiet strength in the way she held herself. She was ready, even if she wasn't fully healed. She had shown up again, and that meant more than any speech or dramatic confrontation ever could. Karen arrived 5 minutes before the hearing was set to begin. Her hair was pulled into the same severe bun, but it looked tighter today, almost desperate in its symmetry. Her makeup was heavier, perhaps to project confidence or maybe to mask the fatigue carved into her features. Her lawyer walked beside her briskly, muttering something under his breath, no doubt rehearsing last-minute strategy. But despite the suit, the makeup, the stiff posture, Karen looked different now. Not invincible. Not superior. Just tired. Defensive. Small in all the ways that mattered. She didn't glance in our direction this time. If anything, she avoided it. The woman who had once stood towering and furious over our cafe table now kept her eyes fixed on the floor, as if it might open and swallow her whole if she wished hard enough. The judge entered precisely on time, her robe sweeping behind her like a curtain closing on the last act of a play. The courtroom rose and fell into silence again, and the judge immediately turned her attention to the folder in front of her. She didn't waste time with pleasantries or a recap. She had spent the last 2 days reviewing footage, statements, transcripts, and today she was here to render her decision. Her voice was level, clear, and final. The court has reviewed the evidence in the matter of the state of California versus Karen Mitchell. After careful consideration, it is the determination of this court that the defendant, Ms. Mitchell, is guilty of misdemeanor assault and attempted bodily harm. The evidence clearly shows an unprovoked and deliberate act of aggression toward a non-threatening individual. Furthermore, the court acknowledges the psychological and emotional distress caused by the attack, particularly given the public setting and the vulnerable state of the victim. There was no reaction from Karen, no gasp, no protest. Her lawyer barely blinked. Perhaps they had both expected it. The judge continued, her tone unchanging but resolute. Ms. Mitchell is hereby sentenced to 100 hours of community service, a mandatory anger management course to be completed within 90 days, and a fine of $5,000 to be paid to the state. Additionally, the court orders a separate restitution payment of $2,500 to the victim for medical expenses and emotional distress. This court does not tolerate aggression disguised as entitlement, nor will it excuse assault masked as discomfort. Your actions were inexcusable and dangerous, and while this sentence does not erase the harm done, it serves as a formal acknowledgement that your behavior was unacceptable and unlawful. The gavel struck once, sharp, final, echoing across the chamber like a thunderclap, and just like that it was over. Karen's lawyer leaned in to whisper something to her, but she didn't respond. Her eyes remained locked forward, her hands clenched in her lap. She looked neither shocked nor repentant, just hollow. For a moment, I wondered if she understood the gravity of what had just happened, if she felt the weight of her actions now that they had consequences. But it didn't matter. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about my sister. And as we stood to leave, I turned to her, ready to offer comfort or reassurance, only to find her already looking at me. Her expression calm, her mouth slightly curved in a way that almost looked like peace. Outside the courthouse, the sky was pale and gray, the kind of weather that promises rain but never delivers. We walked down the front steps slowly, each footstep feeling lighter than the last, like the ground was finally giving us permission to move forward. The courthouse doors shut behind us with a muted click, and my sister took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the cool air wash over her. When she opened them again, she looked at me and smiled, truly smiled, the first one I'd seen in weeks that wasn't forced or dulled by anxiety. "I didn't think I'd feel anything," she said softly. "But I do. Not relief exactly, just clarity, like a window finally opened after being stuck shut." I nodded, understanding more than I could say. Justice, we'd learned, wasn't about dramatic speeches or flashy victories. It was about being heard, being seen, being believed. It was about knowing that the system, flawed as it may be, had stood on your side when it mattered most. And it was about proving to yourself that you could endure, even when everything in you wanted to disappear. We walked to the parking lot without speaking further, content in the shared quiet. Before getting into the car, I looked back at the courthouse one last time. Inside those walls, a woman who once saw herself as untouchable had been made to answer for her actions. Not violently, not cruelly, but fairly, properly, and that mattered. The next few weeks passed more gently. The burn faded into a faint mark, barely visible under the collar of a shirt. My sister returned to her routine: books, cafes, quiet afternoons in the sun, but with a subtle difference. She no longer flinched when someone spoke loudly nearby. She no longer checked behind her shoulder in public. She was still quiet, still soft, still herself, but now there was something new beneath the surface, something steadier, something earned. And as for Cairn, we heard through the grapevine that she had started her community service at a local shelter, picking up trash along highways and restocking supplies for those in need. Whether she learned anything from it was anyone's guess, but that wasn't our concern anymore. She was no longer the center of the story. She was just the footnote in someone else's chapter of resilience. Sometimes the world tries to tell people like my sister that they are too quiet, too soft, too strange to matter. But that day in the cafe, when someone tried to silence her with heat and cruelty, the world answered back through the voices of strangers, through the calm authority of off-duty detectives, through the clear words of a judge who saw her not as a nuisance, but as a person deserving of dignity and peace. And in the end, that answer spoke louder than anything Cairn could have screamed. Justice wasn't perfect. It didn't erase the pain or the memory, but it was enough to close the chapter, enough to let us breathe, enough to walk away.